When we last discussed Russia, it was serving as, if you will, the death knell for the dreams of the Napoleonic Empire, drawing back within itself and trusting in General Winter and its forces to destroy Napoleon and push his forces back. So we've really not talked about Russia since then, and so I think it's helpful to give them a little bit more background so you can understand what's going on in Russia during this time period. In 1825, Russia suffered a revolt by their military officers that becomes known as the Decembrist revolts. Officers formed secret societies and began advocating for representative government and abolishing serfdom. These secret societies were growing right around the time in 1825 that a new Tsar ascended the throne. This was Nicholas I. And so in December of 1825, the reform-minded Moscow regiment, calling for a constitution and a different Tsar, refused to swear allegiance to the new Tsar, Nicholas I. Nicholas, unsurprisingly, did not like this, ordered the rest of the army to fire upon them, executed the ringleaders, and functionally turned the Decembrists into liberal martyrs for the liberals of Russia. But this revolt was important because it had a profound effect on Nicholas I. Coming into power, having people revolt against his rule right at the outset, made him double down on the principles of conservatism for the purposes of his rule. He committed himself to upholding orthodoxy, autocracy, and Russian nationalism. He became a dyed-in-the-wool conservative and wanted to prevent any outbreak of revolutionary fervor or liberalism within his realm. An example of that firm treatment we've already seen. In 1830, when the Poles rise up, if you'll remember we talked about them in the revolutions of 1830, what happened? Nicholas I, as Tsar, sent in troops and crushed them utterly. And indeed, the strength of the Russian state is the reason why we don't start this lecture with a background on 1848 or talked about Russia during 1848. Nicholas I had so overawed the enemies, so crushed national or liberal sentiment, well, maybe not sentiment, but at least revolutionaries, that Russia did not suffer anything from 1848. His state was strong enough to resist it. But after Nicholas I died, there was a window for potentially true reforms to overtake the Russian state. A new Tsar ascended the throne, and he seemed to herald an age of reform and a chance for Russia to chart a new and different path going forward. This Tsar was Alexander II. And one of his most famous and most important reforms was that in 1861 he abolishes serfdom. Serfdom was a legacy of feudal Russia and a key element of how nobles defined their lives in Russia and saw their wealth. In 1861, however, Alexander announces the emancipation of the serfs of Russia, in which more than 23 million people are freed from serfdom. Serfs were granted the rights of full citizenship and even the opportunities to purchase land that they had worked for nobles. After this, Tsar Alexander II became known as the Tsar Liberator, and he certainly has liberal inclinations, although there is a sense that fear motivated his actions as much as nobility. As he said to a speech to an assembly of Russian nobles, "My intention is to abolish serfdom. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for that time when it starts to abolish itself from below." And so in this, what you should see is Alexander II is recognizing that, like Bismarck and like Cavour, that perhaps those in leadership, conservatives among them, they have to take the lead in managing revolutions, managing change, lest change overtake them. Now, serfdom being abolished is the most famous of Alexander's reforms, but by far it's not the only one he undertook. He undertook judicial and penal reform, an attempt to reform the penal code and the judicial code of Russia. He created new vehicles of local self-government, providing a measure of local councils for people to get involved in governing their small communities. These often were small councils made up of elites and property owners, so certainly it wasn't as if the now freed serfs were getting the right to vote, but it was an example of distilling power down to the local level. Now, while he did not go so far as to create a parliament or create representative government, these local councils were a huge sea change in terms of how Russia was governed. Another reform that he undertakes in 1874 is trying to systematize the process of conscription. Prior to this, conscription was largely enforced on the peasantry, enforced on the serfs. Wealthier members were able to get out of this. And instead, he reorganized and shortened the terms of service. This was a reform intended to bring the Russian army in line with European competitors as much as it was to reform the Russian state. Now, these reforms were necessary as during Alexander II's reign, they would have to grapple with a series of conflicts all centering around the so-called Eastern Question. The Eastern Question was one that had haunted European rulers throughout the 19th century. In sum, what are we going to do with this, the Ottoman Empire? Despite, as what this map suggests, a great deal of successful expansion, by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become, if you will, the sick man of Europe. The question was, what are we going to do with the Ottoman Empire when it implodes? Attempts to deal with the Eastern Question led to a number of foreign conflicts, the first and most famous being the Crimean War. The cause of the war involved the persecution of religious minorities, but the real cause of the conflict was this Eastern Question, the question of what to do with the Ottoman Empire. The Russian Empire went to war against a coalition of powers, and in order to prevent Russia from aggrandizing itself and becoming too powerful at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, the French and British end up sending troops to defend Ottoman interests and defeating Russia in the Crimean War. The Crimean War was famous for not only the famed charge of the Light Brigade, but even the actions of Florence Nightingale in highlighting the problems of nursing in the British forces. And indeed, part of the reason Alexander II may have engaged in his conscription reforms was how poorly the Russian armies fared in these conflicts. Despite fighting in their own land, Crimea, just a railway stop away from the rest of Russia, the British and French seemed to be more successfully able to fight this conflict, even though they were stationing their forces far away and having to resupply them with arms, munitions, and the like by sea. With military reforms in place, however, the Russians were able to do much better in a war against the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s. Russia was able to turn its full attention to the Ottoman Empire, and they were able to achieve a great number of military victories. In the Treaty of San Stefano, the Russians were able to gain a great deal of territory at the Ottomans' expense. Not only did they gain Armenia and Georgia, they also were able to liberate the country of Bulgaria from Ottoman occupation, which had been under Ottoman rule for 500 years. The problem for the Russians, though, were they were a bit too successful. Indeed, the assembled powers of Europe, fearful of Russia becoming too strong from the outcome of this war, organized a Congress of Berlin in 1878 to redress what they thought was a too favorable to Russia treaty. The Eastern Question was always a game of balance. Every European power wanted the territory of the Ottoman Empire, but they didn't want to get it too weak, and they didn't want one power to benefit too much. In this case, you see the changes in the treaty from the Treaty of San Stefano, which is the farmost image, and then the one closer to me is the Congress of Berlin's adjustments. You can see that Bulgaria was greatly curtailed so as to not fatally weaken the Ottoman Empire. The war also crystallized a theme of Russian foreign policy, which was pan-Slavism. This attitude, which would consist of the Russians claiming that they had some connection to their Slavic brethren in the Balkans, would lead the Russians to have a predominant interest in protecting the states of the Balkans, which would lead Russia to becoming more involved on the Balkans on the eve of the First World War. And so Alexander II was seemingly a hero, a Tsar liberator, as well as a hero abroad in terms of fighting against the Ottoman Empire. Unfortunately for Alexander II, his victories did not enable him to overcome the rising tensions within his society, specifically socialism. Despite his many reforms, many socialists believed the Tsar had not gone far enough. He hadn't changed society enough. And one of the socialist groups, the People's Freedom, believed that using terrorism they could upset the existing system and create something new. They are most famous for their efforts to successfully assassinate Alexander II in 1860. And this assassination not only kills the Tsar, but had far graver repercussions. It's likely that the death of this Tsar, the most reformist, if you will, the most quote-unquote liberal of all the Tsars of this more modern period, led his successors to conclude that, well, reform wasn't really worth it. Alexander's death seemed to suggest that future Tsars should not focus on reform, but instead further commit to autocracy and control. This inability to recognize the need for change or the need for reform would leave the Russian state in a precarious position so that when it went to war in 1914 and in the crucible of the Great War, they would leave themselves open to a far graver and devastating revolution, which was the Russian Revolution of 1917.